The paper smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish when Dean Mercer slid it across the packing shed desk and said, "You signed it, Amparo. The grove belongs to the cooperative now." Outside, ripe apricots thudded softly into picking bins, one after another, as if the trees themselves were keeping time. Amparo did not sit down. She kept one hand on the back of the wooden chair Tom had built years ago, and for a moment, her fingers pressed so hard the knuckles went pale. "That's not what you told me," she said. Dean gave her the kind of smile that only works on people he thinks are already beaten. Smooth, patient, almost kind. "I told you the co-op would take over operations and protect your prices. It's all there in the agreement." He tapped the page with a clean nail. "You have shares now." "Shares," Amparo repeated, like it was a word with no flesh on it. He leaned back and glanced through the open shed doors toward the hill, where her late husband's trees stood in long, slanting rows under the afternoon light. Frost-hardy cultivar, Tom used to call them with quiet pride. Fruit that could take a mean spring and still hold its sweetness. Dean shrugged. "You'll need to clear out by the end of the season. But I'm not unreasonable. If you want a few sticks off those old trees for keepsake's sake, take them." A few sticks. That was how he spoke of a lifetime. Of rootstock chosen by hand. Of bark Tom had cut with his grafting knife until the handle was smooth as bone. And if you've ever seen a person understand, all at once, that grief has made them easy to deceive, then you know why Amparo went so still. If this opening already has you feeling for her, like the video and stay with me. Because what those few sticks became later, Dean Mercer never saw coming. To understand why those words cut so deep, you have to see the hill as it used to be. Before the paper, before Dean, before Amparo ever stood in that shed, feeling her own life turn strange in her hands. In the years when Tom was still alive, the orchard woke early and quietly. Dawn came silver over the slope, and the trees held that soft blue color they have before the sun warms them. Tom would already be outside by then, coffee cooling on the fence post, checking buds with rough fingers. He was not a man who talked big. He listened to bark, to weather, to the way cold settled in low ground. If one tree split in a hard winter and another held firm, he remembered. If one branch flowered late and still carried sweet fruit, he marked it with string. That was how he spent years building what others thought was a foolish thing. An old apricot with fragrance, color, and enough strength to survive a bad spring. But fruit with flavor and trees with patience. He would kneel beside a sapling, shaving a clean line with his grafting knife, fitting scion to rootstock as carefully as some men mend watches. Amparo worked beside him in the ordinary way real love often looks. Carrying crates, tying tags, washing mud from buckets in cold water that made her wrists ache. Their life was small, but it was full. And then, one winter morning, Tom left the house in his work coat while frost still whitened the grass. By noon, his coffee cup was still on the counter, untouched. By evening, the light had gone honey-colored over the orchard, and Tom still had not come home. Amparo kept moving because stopping would have made the silence louder. She rinsed the dirt from a picking bucket. She folded the dish towel twice. She stepped onto the porch, then back inside, then out again. The house smelled of cooling beans and the sharp little note of wood smoke from the stove. His cap was still on the peg. His boots were not. There are hours in a person's life that stretch thin as pulled sugar, and that evening was one of them. After that day, the hill changed without changing at all. The same rows stood there, the same ladders leaned in the shed, the same apricots blushed and softened in season. But one set of footsteps was gone, and every chore seemed to notice. Amparo rose before dawn because the trees did not care about morning. She checked the irrigation lines, watched the sky for a bad turn, sorted fruit at the long table while juice dried sticky on her wrists. At night, she sat with Tom's field notebooks open beside a lamp, tracing his blunt handwriting with one finger. People from the valley were kind in the way busy people are kind. They brought pie, said anything you need, and then drifted back into their own harvests, their own weather, their own bills. The buyers did not drift. They called about size, shipping windows, uniformity. New words began circling the old hill: volume, leverage, pooled risk. And right around the time the first late chill touched the leaves, a clean truck started appearing at the end of Amparo's lane. At first, Dean Mercer never came all the way up to the house. He would stop by the gate, step out of that clean truck, and look up the rows like a man admiring something he already imagined managing. He had a gentle voice, the kind that made hard things sound settled before they were settled at all. "Morning, Amparo," he would say, hat in hand, as if he were doing her the courtesy. "Just checking in, seeing how you're holding up." Then he would ask about freight costs, about buyers, about whether she was getting enough help at picking time. The questions were always practical, always reasonable. That was part of what made them dangerous. The valley had started changing while she was busy trying not to fall behind. Small growers were tired. Fuel cost more. Packing took longer. Buyers wanted uniform fruit, same size, same color, same delivery window. Like trees were machines and weather was an employee you could fire. Dean knew exactly where to press. He began saying the same soft phrase all over the hill: better prices together, lower risk together. A cooperative, he said, would give people room to breathe. Amparo listened because she had to listen, not because she agreed. He praised Tom's work, called the orchard special stock, said no one wanted to see a widow struggle alone with something so valuable. Once, standing beside a bin that smelled of leaves and bruised fruit, he added, "Your husband understood quality. He would have wanted protection for this place." That was the first time she looked at him sharply, because Tom had trusted weather before promises, and a man who truly knew him would have known that. And a few days later, Dean came back carrying a folder thick with tabs. The folder did not look dangerous. That was the trouble with it. Dean set it down on Amparo's kitchen table one gray afternoon, while rain ticked against the window screen and damp earth breathed in through the cracked door. The tabs were neat, the pages clean, the kind of paperwork meant to make a person feel childish for hesitating. "You don't have to decide today," he said, though he had come at the busiest hour, when fruit still needed sorting and supper had not even been started. He talked while she stood at the counter with wet hands, listening over her shoulder. Marketing strength, shared storage, better timing with buyers, protection from bad seasons. Every sentence was built to sound like relief. Then he laid a share certificate sample on top, bright paper with a printed seal. "This way," he said, "you still benefit from the value of the land without carrying all the strain alone." Amparo dried her hands on her apron and finally sat down. She read slowly. She was no fool, but grief makes certain words heavier than others, and Dean knew which ones to lift for her and which ones to leave buried. Operating rights, pooled title structure, management authority. He skipped over those the way a man steps over mud when he doesn't want his shoes marked. Instead, he tapped the lines about guaranteed placement and collective bargaining. "Tom built something rare," he said quietly. "Would you really risk losing it just because you're trying to do this alone?" That struck where he meant it to strike. And later that night, after Dean's truck lights vanished down the lane, Amparo opened one of Tom's old notebooks, and a sealed envelope slipped out from between the pages. The envelope had gone soft at the corners from sitting so long inside the notebook. Amparo turned it over under the lamplight. Dean's cooperative had not even existed in its current form when it was mailed, but the sender's name was there all the same. A law office working for the Valley's new pooled growers group. Inside was a letter Tom had never thrown away. He had underlined one paragraph in pencil so hard the mark had pressed through the page. Transfer of title may be bundled with membership restructuring. In the margin, in his blunt hand, he had written only 4 words. Keep land, sell fruit. She sat with that for a long time. But morning still came. Fruit still had to be moved. Buyers still called. And grief has a cruel way of wearing down even the warnings left by the people who loved us best. Dean returned 2 days later, with coffee and sympathy and the same folder, as if patience itself were proof of honesty. He spoke gently, almost offended that she would worry. That old language doesn't apply to what we're doing now, he said. This is updated, cleaner, safer. He did not rush her pen into motion. That would have made him look eager. Instead, he let her grow tired. He came back after a rain, then after a market call, then again during picking, always when her apron was stained and her shoulders ached. You need support, Amparo, he said, not another season hanging by your fingernails. In the end, she signed in a bright office that smelled of toner and polished wood, while Dean flipped tabs and summarized clauses in a calm voice. 3 weeks later, a certified packet arrived in her mailbox, and before she even opened it, she felt cold. She opened the packet at the kitchen sink, with the late sun hitting the faucet and the smell of warm fruit still clinging to her sleeves. The first page was written in that chilly, careful language that sounds polite while it takes something from you. Membership conversion complete. Title vested under cooperative land structure. Seasonal transition requirements in effect. Amparo read each line once, then again, slower, as if the words might turn into different words if she looked hard enough. By the time she reached the part about vacating the residence attached to the orchard before the season closed, the paper had started trembling in her hands. She drove straight to the packing shed. Dean was there, of course, walking a new member through crate counts with his sleeves rolled neatly and that same easy tone. When he saw her coming, he dismissed the other man with a nod and said, "Amparo, I was going to call." "No," she said, and set the packet on the table between them. "You were going to wait until I had no room left to ask questions." He glanced down, then back at her. No apology, not even the shape of one. The cooperative can't function if everyone wants custom terms. You told me this was about selling together. It is, he said, and managing together. That's the model. This says I have to leave my own house. He drew in a quiet breath, as if she were the one making the moment unpleasant. The cottage is tied to the productive block. Central management needs clear control. If you've ever heard a person realize, in real time, that kindness was only packaging, then you know how silent that shed became. Dean reached for a clipboard, scribbled something, and pushed it toward her. "By the way," he said, "if you want pruning access before turnover, you'll need to schedule it." The clipboard was worse than the packet somehow. It turned her own trees into a list of permitted actions. Block access by request, tool removal by date, final personal collection before transfer. Dean had written it in quick blue ink, like a man leaving grocery notes for someone already halfway out the door. Amparo looked at it, then at him, and for one sharp second, he seemed smaller than the harm he had done. Smaller and meaner. "What exactly do you think I am to this place?" she asked. Dean lowered his eyes to the table, not from shame, but from calculation. "A shareholder," he said, "and I'm trying to make this orderly." Orderly. There are words that ought to rattle in a person's mouth when they use them. That was one. She did not argue again in the shed. Some betrayals become clearer the moment you stop asking for decency and realize none is coming. Amparo went home, walked through each room before dark, and began deciding what a season could carry away. The house smelled of cedar drawers and sun-warmed curtains. In the bedroom, Tom's spare coat still hung where she had left it. In the pantry, the jars caught the last orange light. She wrapped dishes in old towels, folded his notebooks, tied kitchen spoons with twine. Ordinary things suddenly felt heavy, as if each one had roots. Then, before full dark, she took a basket and headed uphill. If the land was no longer going to be hers on paper, she would at least take what paper did not know how to value. At the oldest row, beneath branches Tom had marked years ago, she laid her palm against the bark and stood still. The wind smelled faintly of dust and fruit skins. By lantern light, she opened the shed drawer and reached for his old knife. The blade still fit her hand the way Tom's hands had taught it to. Amparo worked by lantern, moving tree to tree with the basket at her feet and the night air cooling fast around her. She knew exactly which branches to take: 1-year wood, healthy, straight, no thicker than a finger, cut clean below a bud. A little from any one tree, not like theft, like stewardship. Each snip sounded small in the dark, but to her it felt larger than speech. She wrapped the cuttings in damp cloth as she went. Some she tagged from memory, some from old marks Tom had tied seasons ago. The bark smelled green and sharp. Sap shone at the cut ends in the lantern light. This was lineage, not fruit for market, not something Dean would brag about in a meeting. The part of the orchard that could travel in a basket if it had to. By the time dawn thinned the eastern sky, she had gathered only a modest bundle of heirloom scion wood, enough to begin again somewhere, if somewhere could be found. She carried it to the sink, refreshed the cloth, and set the bundle in the coolest room of the house. The rest of that week moved like a person walking in cold water. She packed, she loaded what she could, she left behind what could not be made small. When cooperative crews finally came to mark rows and measure storage, Dean passed through once, glanced at the wrapped cuttings on the porch bench, and gave a little breath through his nose. "Those?" he said. "Take your few sticks, Amparo." She did. And 3 days later, with the last of her boxes tied down, she turned onto a rough, rented track above the valley and saw the patch of ground that would have to answer for everything now. The little rented patch sat hard against the wind, with stones in the soil and a view back down toward the valley where the bigger orchards rolled out like a green quilt. Amparo worked there quietly, because quiet was all she had left that still belonged to her. She set the young trees in their rows, watered them by hand, and tied each one to a thin stake so the gusts would not lean them crooked. Some mornings the ground smelled of dust. Some mornings it smelled of wet clay and roots. It was not much land, but she treated it like a promise. Down below, Dean Mercer was having his season. The co-op trucks moved in clean lines. The packing shed stayed busy. People spoke about efficiency now, about consistency, about a new fruit that would open bigger markets. Dean liked those words. He used them often, standing in front of growers with his sleeves rolled up and his voice warm as tea. He told them uniform trees meant fewer surprises. He told them the valley needed to think like one body instead of many small hands. And the growers listened. Why wouldn't they? The first years looked good. Boxes stacked neatly. Buyers smiled. Dean shook hands and called it progress. Amparo heard about the change in pieces, never all at once. A neighbor said the old mixed blocks were being top-worked. Another said Dean had brought in a frost-hardy cultivar that packed well and looked pretty on the shelf. No one asked her opinion. By then, she was only the widow on the hill, with a few young trees and too much weather. Still, when she walked her rows at dusk, she could feel the cold settling earlier than it should have. The leaves were still green, but the air had that sharp edge that warned a person to watch the sky, and then watch it harder. The first hard frost came before sunrise. Amparo knew it by the sound, that brittle hush that falls over a valley when the air itself starts to bite. She stepped outside with her shawl pulled tight, and the little trees on her rented patch stood silvered and still, each leaf rimmed white. Her breath showed in front of her like smoke. Below, the co-op blocks changed color in the dim light. Where the leaves had been green the day before, they now drooped, dark and wet, as if the cold had pressed all their life out at once. By mid-morning, the road was full of trucks slowing to a crawl. Growers stood in muddy boots beside ruined rows, touching blackened buds with their fingertips, saying nothing for a long time. That silence told her everything before anyone spoke, and when they did speak, they said her name, not with warmth, with need. Amparo, one man called from the fence line, hat in hand. You still have wood from Tom's trees, don't you? Another voice followed. Just a few grafts, maybe enough to save a block. A woman with red eyes stepped closer and looked past the little nursery to the tagged sticks she had been protecting all this time. We heard those trees held through the freeze. Amparo did not smile. She only turned and lifted the cloth from the tray where the heirloom scion wood lay waiting, pale and living, and suddenly worth more than the polished promises Dean had spent years selling. Bring your rootstock, she said softly. And then, from the valley road, she saw Dean Mercer's truck climbing toward her hill. By the time Dean's truck reached the hill, the line of growers was already there. They stood along the fence and by the nursery beds, boots dusty, hats in hand, each one carrying the same nervous hope a person gets when the thing they feared has finally arrived. Dean stepped out and tried to wear the same calm smile he always did. It did not fit him now, with the blackened valleys below and the eyes on his face. Amparo, he said, almost lightly, you've been busy. She did not answer that. She only watched him look at the bundles of young trees, at the tray of cuttings, at the hands of people waiting for her to speak. This was the first time he had seen her with others around her who did not need his permission. A man from the lower rows asked, "Can you really help us save any of it?" Amparo lifted one of the cuttings and turned it so the light caught the bud. If the rootstock takes, yes. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough. Dean's mouth tightened. He tried to recover the old tone, the easy tone. We should talk privately. No, Amparo said. That one word went farther than a raised voice ever could. You could feel it settle in the group. The growers looked at her, then at him. Dean had spent years talking about shared control, but now the sharing was happening without him. He had sold them a promise of order, and she was handing them something much older. Living wood. He looked from one face to another, then back to the line of grafts waiting on the table. And for the first time, Dean Mercer seemed to understand that he had come too late to own the season. Dean did not leave when she told him to wait. He stood by the fence with his hands open at his sides, no smile left in him now, just the look of a man who has run out of easy words. Behind him, the growers kept their distance, watching the young trees and then watching him. The morning wind moved through the nursery and rattled the tags softly against the stakes. Amparo, he said at last, quieter than before. The co-op needs to talk terms. She kept her eyes on the tray in her lap. The cut ends of the scions were fresh, still pale and moist. The co-op had years to talk terms, she said. Now it has frost. One of the growers almost laughed, then stopped himself. Dean swallowed and tried again. We can't replace every block overnight. But your wood? Tom's strain? It's the only thing people are asking about. The board wants a supply agreement. There it was. Need. Amparo set the tray down and wiped her hands on her apron. Then ask like a neighbor, she said, not like an owner. That one landed harder than any raised voice. Dean looked away toward the road, where his truck sat with the engine off and dust drying on the hood. For a moment, the whole hill seemed to hold still. Even the growers stopped shifting their feet. Then Dean reached into his folder and drew out a single page, holding it between two fingers. I was sent with this, he said. They want your answer before noon. Amparo glanced at the page, then at the seal in the corner, and felt the air change again. Because she already knew that seal. Amparo looked at Dean's page, then at the men and women waiting behind her, and she knew this was the moment that decided what kind of harvest the valley would have next year. She did not hand over her wood to one buyer, and she did not sell the strain back into the same hands that had taken her grove. Instead, she asked for the growers to gather the next morning under the old shed roof. There, with Tom's notebook open beside her and the smell of damp sawdust in the air, she laid out a simple trust. Fair licenses, shared training, no land stripped away for joining, no one forced to surrender title to stay in business. Dean stood there while it was read aloud, his face tight and gray, because he understood at last that the thing he had mocked was becoming the only thing the valley could not replace. By noon, people were lining up with rootstock, buckets, and clipping knives, not because one man owned the future, but because they had finally learned to hold it together. And that is what the frost left behind, 100 small grafts taking in borrowed light. The branch Amparo carried out in a basket became rows of living trees in many hands. And the hill that had been used against her was no longer something that could be taken so easily. By evening, she stood alone for a moment at the edge of the nursery. The wind moved through the young leaves, soft as a whisper over water. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment with your country or city. And if you want more tales where patience outlasts greed, stay close.